Well, good morning, River Church. My name is Bryan, and I get the opportunity and privilege to be one of the pastors here at River Church and to speak with you guys this morning. We are rolling through our series. It's all about 2020, right? The year 2020, but also having 2020 vision within our faith. Specifically, we're looking at refocusing in our faith. And we've talked about a few specific areas. We've talked about individually within our own lives, and we looked at Romans 12:2 and talked about how we're supposed to be transformed and not conformed, right? And then we talked about using our gifts and talked about groups and the importance of that within our lives as we pursue the Lord and try to be more like Him. Today, we're talking about probably, if I were to poll, churches or even you guys, the least liked subject to preach upon. Can anybody guess what that is? Money, right? Yeah. Money. Yeah. I was going to sing that when I came out, but I think I did that joke last year, so I figured I couldn't this year. So for me as a pastor, I grew up in some churches that talked about money all the time, right? And I hated it. I hated it because I felt like every time a visitor came, every time something was going on, that we had people in the house, we were just talking about money. And I'm like, man, let's not talk about money so much. So for me, when I prepare, we talk about money usually once a year because we go over our 4 G's, right? And one of our G's is giving. And these are the practical things that we do as we pursue God. They're what we would call steps of faith, right? And we take those steps of faith and we grow in our relationship with God and we grow more into His likeness. But for me, one of the most difficult things to do is to preach about money specifically, right? Because I always don't want to talk about money, but I want to talk about the heart that's behind it. So this sermon has changed 3 times in the last 3 days, right? I literally had one entirely written, and I was like, I don't know, going back and forth, just praying and asking the Lord what He had, and He kind of just shifts it around. Because money it's a big thing within our lives, right? Where there is money, there is possibility. We've been looking at a couple houses, recently. Shout out to Carrie, who's been taking us around, looking at a few different places. And we're looking and we're thinking about possibilities, right? But possibilities only come with money within those houses, right? I'm going to kind of confess something up here to you guys. But a couple years ago, Mega Millions was $1 billion, right? And I don't play the lottery really. I don't do a whole lot of gambling. But I decided, you know what, man, I'm getting, just a little bit. Yeah, just a little bit. Man, I grew up in a small country town and we just played poker, it's okay. But, man, how do I get track from that? But so I'm at the gas station. I'm at Speedway, all right? Some of you, I might lose you completely on this because you're like, a pastor played the lottery, what? But I'm at Speedway, and I'm getting one of their big old Coke Zeros, they used to be really cheap. They raised the price. I'm really annoyed over it. But hey, anyways, I'm getting a Coke Zero, and I look up, and they got this little flashing sign, and they're like, $1.2 billion, right? And I'm like, whoo, that's a lot of money, right? And I'm like, you know what? I'd never pay it. I'm like, it's only $1, right? I'm like, here's $1. She's like, oh, do you want the Mega Ball? And I'm like, what's the Mega Ball? And she's like, oh, you need it if you want to win all the money. So I'm like, okay. And she's like, $2. I'm like, I paid another whole $1 just for one extra ball? I didn't know what was going on. So it was one of my first times ever playing it. For some of you, you just know this, right? And I play it, all right? And then immediately for the next 2 days, do you know what my mind was doing? Woo, it was wandering, right? I was going here, I was buying this. I was thinking about buying my grandma's old farm in Ohio and creating a cul-de-sac for my family to live in, so when we go back up and visit, we have a house there, we have a house here, we get in a beach house, we get in a mountain house, we probably get one in France too, $1 billion. I'm living everywhere for a little bit of time. So I'm rolling through all these scenarios, right? And the day comes, the drawing comes, okay? Kid you not. You can't make this stuff up, right? This is how enticing the devil is. All right, I had 3 numbers the same, and I think it was the 4 other ones were off by 1 number. So do you know what my immediate reaction was? I gotta go play again. Right? Because I was even closer to those possibilities, and I was thinking about money and all the things that I could do with that, right? But the fact of the matter is we live in a world where to do things, it oftentimes takes money. right? Like one of the things that I am passionate about is church planting, right? And one of the things that I would love to see River Church eventually do is to be a hub for church planters. Specifically, I was talking with Carrie about a house that is just down the street here. We could get it for like $25,000, right? And I'm like, oh man, that's just an amazing opportunity. We could literally buy that for the church and then have this opportunity for people to come in, whether it's a family to live there that's going to church plan, or whether it's a bunch of like single dudes with residency, right? And like brainstorming about all these ideas. And I'm like, okay, you know what that takes though? It takes money, it takes resources, right? And like just everything that we envision that we do and everything that we want to become, what we recognize, whether it's as humans or as a church, it takes money, right? And it's a necessary thing for us to talk about, right? Because there's probably nothing more in our lives that can be so tempted to grip our hearts than our money. Like it can take control like nothing else. Sometimes it only takes you buying a ticket with a 1 in 192 million chance of winning that specifically. Matthew 6:24 tells us specifically, he said, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." A lot of people say, if you want to see what is important to somebody, go and check their checking account, right? Like, or their checkbook is what they used to say. Now they probably would say their credit card statement. If you truly want to see what's important within your own life, where you're investing the majority of your money, you can simply go and look specifically, right? There's another verse that I was looking at that really kind of hit me because it's kind of the world that we live in. It's in Luke 12:33. I'm going to have you guys turn there because I want you to look at this. We're going to kind of be all over this morning. We're going to settle on one specific passage of Scripture, but kind of just want to get the heart behind giving and help us to kind of, focus on the heart behind it all, because it's not about like how much, it's about the why behind what we're doing. So Luke 12, we're going to look specifically at verse 33. So this is Jesus speaking, right? Giving some instruction and trying to provide basically a little bit of understanding about materials and money and the investment and where we're at with all of that. So he says in verse 33, "Sell your possessions and give to the needy." This is the part I want to focus for. He says, "Provide yourself with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in heaven that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys." There's a specific part in that verse. It says, "Provide for yourself with money bags that do not grow old," right? I found this like really comical in the day and age that we live in, right? Because like we all, like not we all, not myself personally, maybe you ladies, want to carry around these fancy purses, right? Like Michael Kors, Gucci, Coach, all this crazy stuff. When I was in high school, they had these things called purse parties that like all of my friends went to because they couldn't afford the real things, and they go to these like sketchy knockoff parties, right? If you've ever done one of those, I'm sorry, I don't mean that like that. But they'd go to these parties, right? Because they wanted to have these purses, right? But the problem with these purses is the same problem with anything, right? They go out of fashion really quickly. Right? Or maybe they get worn out. Like Heidi had one real black leather Coach purse, and she had it, and she used it probably for the first 5 years of our marriage, and then one day the strap just broke, right? Like it grew old, and I think she was pretty sad. But like it is this image that we see here, right? Like these money bags that we have, these things that we invest into, basically they grow old, right? They're just going to wither away. Like this purse that you spend $200 on, right? In 10 years, it will probably be sitting in your closet, or maybe in Goodwill, or maybe if it has somewhat of life left in it, maybe eBay, where you're trying to sell it for a quarter of the price that you bought it for. And I'm not condemning necessarily like buying these purses or any of these types of things. The question is this is a pattern within our lives. Like, are we investing more into temporal things, or are we investing more into eternal things? Right? I talked about the joke a couple of weeks ago. I was working through something with somebody and their finances and trying to just live out what Christ has called us to do. And one of the jokes that I said was that my father was rich, right? And one of the other jokes that I have is like, my retirement is huge. Like I've got a great retirement that's just not here on this earth, right? Because I'm investing that into the future, and the future of eternity, not necessarily the future of the temporal. And this verse puts this into perspective for us, right? He's saying, like, to give these things, to allow our hearts to be ready to move when there is a need that is presented, right? Because that type of investment doesn't grow old. That type of investment doesn't just fade away. It is there for all of eternity, right? It does not fail. It cannot be stolen. It cannot be destroyed. It goes with you. See, and I think that so often, I wanted to bring it to this initially because I think we just get so distracted with all the things that the world has to offer. Hey, myself included, right? Like, I am no different. I've talked about it before. I really want a Can-Am Spyder, and I've always wanted a Can-Am Spyder, but I just can't bring myself to make that type of purchase at this point because, it's not responsibly or financially responsible for us with looking into investing in a house and having 2 kids and all these different opportunities that there are, right? But like so often we get caught up in the temporal with so many things in our life, and specifically with money. Like, money has a way to do this that really nothing else probably does, right? Maybe lust and sexual enticement is probably the closest thing that there is to this, that kind of lures us away, like a little bit by little bit, right? And before we know it, like we're standing in this heap of materialism, or in that case, lust, right? And there's this opportunity for us just in this new year to be able to refocus our hearts and minds on the call that God has within our lives when it comes to money and how we should use it. So if you guys have your Bibles, again, turn with me to Mark chapter 12. We're going to look at verses 41 through 44. This will be the main passage that we kind of talk about with this specific topic. That's Mark 12, verses 41 through 44. Hey, was that me? I have the pinger too, so I thought maybe I hit it. I'm going to turn with you. Mark 12, verses 41 through 44. It says, starting in verse 41, "And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering boxes. Many rich people were putting in large sums of money, or large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples and said to them, 'Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, had put everything she had in, and everything that she had to live on.'" So we're going to break down that verse a little bit just so we can kind of understand what's happening there, right? So Jesus is at the temple. His disciples are at least, within a yelling distance of him, or calling out of distance to him. So Jesus is sitting there. I don't know if his disciples are sitting right beside him or not and following along in this, right? But they're basically watching people bring their money and putting it into the treasury. And this is really interesting, right? Like, because I think about this specifically, like within the context of today, it would be super sketch, right? If I posted up a chair back there by that offering box and I just sat there and watched as it went in, right? And just looking as it goes in, maybe not making any specific comments, but just watching. I got this guy beside me that I'm trying to disciple here, and I got this other guy beside me, and we're all just chilling back there at the offering boxes, watching the money be put in, right? It's kind of a fun scenario, which probably wasn't necessarily something out of the ordinary. These temples were very busy, people coming in and out, to give these offerings, to make sacrifices, to do all of these things, right? So they're looking at the treasury specifically. And this treasury, it was believed to be basically 13 Trump-shaped receptacles, right? Not like Trump the president, but like a Trump, right? receptacles where you would walk in and you would place your offering. Right, so you got all these like Trump things that are coming up here, and you put them in there, and your money slides down and in. And they would give a couple different things here. They would give temple tax, right, which was like basically the necessity that they had to pay to the temple because they lived around, or that was their temple that they worshipped at. And the second thing that they would give was money that was voluntarily given for various purposes. It could be, maybe it's a need that the temple was going to try to help meet. Maybe they just sold in abundance and they're trying to give their 10% off the top of that, right? But they're basically sitting there as these people are coming and they're putting in their offerings. And there's a contrast of two people here. The first is the rich people, right? The rich people come in and they're putting in these large lump sums. And then in verse 42 it says, a poor widow came in. And it says that she put in 2 small copper coins. These 2 small copper coins within the Greek text were called a lepta, right? And it was the smallest coin in circulation in Palestine at that point. The crazy thing is that it was 1/64 of a denarius, right? And a denarius was typically what they believed as a common man's wage, right? So whatever you would make in a day. So if you work a job and you're working minimum wage, right? I think it's $8.25 here. Is that right? Maybe $8.25-ish here. We'll go $8 because I'm not great with math when it comes to like fractions. So we'll go $8 working for an 8-hour day. You got $64, right? So she's putting the equivalent of like what would be $1, so to say, in our day and age. They would break it down into pennies, basically to show you that it's worthless, right? The idea here isn't how much money she's putting in, right? But to show you that it's just not really worth anything. Like, ultimately, what she's putting in was very, very, very little significant. The people that were collecting the temple tax probably would have cared so little about it that they may have cast it to the side. I don't know if any of you guys are like this. If there's like a quarter on the ground, I'm stopping to pick that thing up, right? Like, is anybody else like that? If there's a dime, I'm thinking about, it's a dime. I'm going to grab it. If there's a nickel, I'm like, how clean is it, right? Like, I got to look at that. But for the most part, if there's a penny on the ground, like, I don't even stop for pennies, right? Like, I'm just like, it's just a penny. I do feel conviction at some points because I question myself. I'm like, is that being a bad steward if I don't pick up that penny? But hey, I don't really stop for pennies. I don't know if any of you guys stop for pennies. If you do, you're a better steward than I am. There you go. But like, basically, like, it's showing like the worthlessness of this, right? Breaking it down to even what we would account to a penny, right? She's throwing a penny in the offering, and they say that specifically probably today it'd be worth only a fraction of a penny. So he watches this take place, right? These rich people putting in these large lump sums, and this widow comes and she basically just puts in what we would consider like a penny, and we'll call it a penny for the sake of continuing with the story. And then he calls his disciples to him. He said, hey guys, come on and gather around me. I'm going to tell you something. And he says, truly I say to you this, the poor widow has put more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. And already within that statement, there's like this paradox, right? Like, this poor widow, there's no way that she's putting as much money as this tax collector who's super wealthy over here, or this doctor who's super wealthy over here, or maybe even some of the government leaders that were coming into the temple and giving their sums of money, right? Who literally were hundreds, if not thousands of times larger than theirs. But there's a picture that Jesus wants us to see here. There's an understanding that he wants us to come to, and that's that giving, right, isn't based upon the amount, but it's based upon how your heart is positioned. Right? The focus isn't upon what you give or how much you give. It's what kind of attitude, what type of reverence are you giving from? Verse 44 tells us why this paradox is true. It says, for they all contributed out of their abundance. But she gave out of her poverty everything she had, all she had to live on. And it's crazy because this is like a really radical example for us to see and for us to follow, right? Like as a pastor, typically I would never tell you Like if all you have is $12 for that day and you're not going to get paid and you need that money to specifically eat on, like I'm never going to ask you or call you to give that money to the church, right? Like I would say, hey, no, you go eat with that money, right? But there's a demonstration here that Christ is trying to make, right? He's trying to move his disciples' hearts and even our hearts as his followers to understand, right, that there's a measure of dependence and faith in giving, right? There's a couple types of giving. There's abundance giving and there's sacrificial giving, right? And sacrificial giving is the one type of giving that really truly shows the posture of our heart. Because it's not like, oh, we have this extra. It's like, no, my faith and dependence for this widow was solely fixed on the Lord, right? She knew that she didn't have much, but she knew that the only person she had to depend on was the Lord. She may not even have been able to buy food that day with that amount, right? But she recognized ultimately who her provider was. And in faith, she gives that money back to him, I think expecting and hoping in faith that God would in turn bless her. And what it shows us so much is that the attitude is more important than the action, right? The action of giving or how much you give matters very little ultimately. It's about the condition of our hearts when we're ready to give that money or to give those resources. And here's the scary thing with this specifically, right? Like sacrifice, if we're going to give sacrificially, it takes faith and it takes trust. Like we're just not naturally going to go in and to give sacrificially. There has to be a measure of trust in the one that you're giving sacrificially to, right? Because you know that in turn there will be something greater that will be provided for you. And maybe not in that moment, maybe it's times to come. But Jesus was intentionally telling his disciples to be generous to the extreme, right? Like he wanted them to be radically generous, willing to give everything away because that would in turn show the love of God, right? And the dependence and faith and trust on God. And I think specifically about that, right? Like when we step back, one of the things that we're talking about this year is allowing ourselves to see the awe and wonder of God within our midst, but also for those that are around us in our community, in our neighborhood, to see the awe and wonder of God, right? And that's only going to happen when we live the way that Christ has called us to live, right? And this type of giving, right? Like when we listen to this story, I step back and I sit in awe and wonder of that poor widow thinking, could I do that, right? Could I truly give that sacrificially? Do I have that type of faith and dependence? Is my heart oriented so much towards God that I would be willing to do that if he called me to do so? And if I'm honest, when I sat back and thought about it, I don't know. I don't know, right? And this example is given to us not as like this expectation that we have within our life that we're going to walk within this, but it's a call, right, for us to follow within this. And maybe we start by following in small ways, right? Because this woman was willing to give everything. Some commentators even talked about how she was a picture, ultimately, of Christ and his sacrificial giving that he would later do. Matthew 20:28 tells us about that a little bit. It says, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. See, when Christ came, he literally came and gave everything that he had, right? Every ounce of his being, every morsel of his flesh, right? Every beat of his heart, every breath that he took, he ultimately came and gave that as a free will offering to us. Everything that he had, right? And that's the beauty of the gospel. And if you sit here and you've never thought about giving, or maybe, giving isn't something that you've even contemplated a lot, and you don't understand the reason why someone would even give, maybe it's because you don't understand what Christ has given for you. And maybe you need to come to an acknowledgement of the sacrifice that he has made on your behalf, right? The fact that he came and lived a sinless life for 33 and a half years and then was put to death because of our sin. The weight of our punishment, he bore upon his shoulders, right? So that one day when he finished it and defeated death and rose from the grave, that we could walk in the freedom of knowing that we could have a relationship with Christ and that we could spend eternity with him. That's the type of sacrifice that he gave, and that's the type of sacrifice that inspires us to give and to live sacrificially. Again, it's not about how much, right? It is and always has been about the heart when it comes to money. Like we said at the beginning, there are very few things in this world that have the opportunity or the tendency to grip our hearts like money does. And I think that Satan, being as crafty as he is, he's intentional with that, right? He'll look for opportunities or ways to allow money to grip our hearts and our minds, right? To become this idol in our life that we begin to prioritize slowly over God. And he does it in small and subtle ways. And I think that sometimes God takes circumstances in our lives, right, to allow us to be refocused or reoriented back to the one who truly holds all the wealth. There's a clear call within our lives to be giving. And it's found in a couple different ways, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. And even as I struggle to kind of articulate probably these next few points, because I get kind of nervous talking about specifically God's call on your life to give, right, and the instructions that are placed within the New Testament, because I'm not trying to do it for the sake of conviction or the furtherance of River Church by bringing in more income. I'm trying to do it because your relationship with Christ is directly tied to that, right? Because it's about your heart. And that giving isn't necessarily always to the church or to these things, right? But our relationship with Christ is often, or not, if not often, always tied to how we handle our money. And so often we don't think about that. We don't see that. We kind of separate these things. But the fact of the matter is Jesus talked about money and finances almost more than he did any other subject in the New Testament. Because he knew the tendency that was within our hearts. He knew the tendency that was within our lives, right? And how easily money can become our God. And how easily we can make decisions based on money as opposed to eternal impact. And that's why there's all these analogies, right? All these things about pocketbooks growing old and wineskins and all of these things, right? Like that demonstrate to us that the call within our lives is allow our hearts to be oriented towards God, recognizing that everything that we have from him, every resource that we have is a good and perfect gift from him, that we don't own it. It isn't ours to begin with. One of the passages that I was going to look at specifically was the talents, right? The parable of the talents. And within that, each person is giving a certain amount of talents, and every one of them, the expectation is the same, that they would use those talents ultimately to bring glory to God and to bring more resources to him. And it's clear that within each and every one of our lives sitting in here, if you are a follower of Christ, God has equipped you with some measure of gift or talent that you are to pour back out to him as an offering and as an opportunity to further his kingdom and his gospel. There's two types of giving that we specifically talk about within the New Testament. The first one is giving to the church. 1 Corinthians 16:2 says, "On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come." So this is Paul talking to the church of Corinth, telling them to come and to present this offering, right? And this offering that is being presented is going to go to the churches for the furtherance of the gospel and the furtherance of his kingdom. And he's telling the believers there in Corinth, hey, on the first day of every week, as you get your paycheck, right, as you get your wages, take a little bit of that, and I want you to go ahead and just set that aside, and then when I come, we'll present that to the offering, right? And this is the verse that a lot of pastors will go and they'll run to, and they say, hey, every single week, first day of every week, which is technically Sunday, you should be coming and presenting that offering here, right? Which, I mean, the outline for that is laid out here. But when we give those instructions apart from recognizing the heart that is behind those instructions, I think we often miss the point. And I think that when it becomes this repetitive action, right, that we kind of almost become numb to it and what we're actually doing. I talked with Heidi about this about a few months ago because, we give usually every other week because we get paid every 2 weeks. And we were specifically talking about that because I look at it every time that I'm able to press the button on my phone to give the money, that I'm offering an act of worship back to the God, right? Recognizing what he has given to me. And out of that abundance that he has given to me, I am giving back to the Lord. And I always try to allow my heart to kind of revel in the gratitude that I have within my life in those moments. And I realized that Heidi, even though it's her finances too, right, doesn't get to partake in that worship with me, even though it's ours, right? Like it's collectively ours. And it has just become something that she knows that I'm doing, when really it's intended to be an act of worship. It's an act of faith and dependence on the Lord that we should be doing collectively. So I've tried to get better about telling her when I'm about to do it or if I'm going to do it, because I want her heart to be oriented around us giving back to the Lord and not just be an expectation that we have in our lives. So that's one type of giving. The second type of giving specifically is the needs of the saints, right? We go back to the verse that Paul talked about in Acts 2:42. We specifically see this being played out within the church as he talks about the believers who are selling their possessions and giving to each as they have need. So those are the two types of giving that we mainly see in the New Testament. But both of those types of giving, they come back to one thing, and that is our hearts, right? Giving is intended to be about the heart. One verse we talked about last year that I didn't want to just break down and talk about again this year, but it's just so good that I felt like I couldn't not end with this and not come back to this, because it really is the staple of giving. It's 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7. I'm going to have you guys turn there too. 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7. So 2 Corinthians, starting in chapter 9, verse 6. It says, "The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." Here's the key verse I want to focus on. "But each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." And I think that's the verse that anytime that I'm preaching or talking specifically about giving, that I always try to come back to, right? Because your giving is between you and the Lord. It's ultimately a conversation that you have, right? Collectively, if you're married with your spouse and the Lord, to decide, what is the Lord calling us to do? Are there opportunities maybe where we can give sacrificially so that our, faith and dependence on the Lord could be strengthened? And we do this because we don't want it to be something that like we're compelling you to do, right? Like I've failed you today if I've preached a sermon and you feel compelled because of me to give, right? We win today if we see that the heart, and our heart specifically, and its posture of how it's pointed or positioned, is directly affected by our money, and we recognize that, right? And out of the gratitude for all that God has done for me in my life, I'm going to give back to him. I was reading a book that was talking about community. It was talking about gospel-oriented community specifically. And one of the things that struck me is that it talked about people who are very generous in giving. Most of the time, it's one of two things. One, they have an abundance of money, so much so that they don't even know what to do with it, right? And they just give it away. And those are like very few and far between. The second one is that the people that are the most generous are the people who are just grateful, right? Because out of thankfulness, charity is birthed. I want you to think about this, right? Like you may be inspired in moments to give money, right? Like if someone's house burns down, right? Like you recognize the devastating consequences of that house burning down. But at some point in your heart, right, there is a measure of gratitude. Like you're thankful that you still have your house and you want to help provide whatever you can to that person because you recognize how great it is to have your house, right? And to have the things that God has given you. And I think that when we settle within our hearts, right, the gratitude for everything that God has done for us, the overflow of that is giving back to him. Right? That's the idea of being a cheerful giver. Right? It's saying that I'm going to give cheerfully, and nobody likes to necessarily give money away, right? Because that's not necessarily a fun thing. But when we do it with a grateful heart, because we recognize all that God has done for us, it allows us to be cheerful because we recognize that we get to give a portion of what he's given us, right? Like not even a big portion, like this poor widow, maybe a couple copper pennies to throw back in there as an act of worship to him. The call is pretty simple for us. It's to inspect our hearts to see where our treasure is. Right? Like, what are the things that we are treasuring? And if our hearts are showing us that we're treasuring other things, then maybe we need to take time and to refocus, right? To reorient before God. To see that we're not called to give reluctantly or under compulsion. And if you're not at the point where you feel like you can give without being reluctant or under compulsion, then I would say don't give. Which is crazy for a pastor to stand up here and say that, right? Like if you don't feel that way, right? But the point that I want to show you is it's about your heart within giving, right? It's not about the amount. It's not about the action. It's about the attitude that is behind it. And if your heart isn't ready for that, then we need to have other conversations prior to that. And I don't know where you're at with that, right? Like, I don't know. Last year we took time and you and your spouse, or you prayed it within your own seat to just kind of ask God where you were at with that specifically. And we're not going to take that time necessarily today, but I'm going to invite the band to come back up. And I want you to think about this. I want you to have this discussion. Like if you're sitting there in your seat and this is hard for you to listen to, it's probably one of two things. Either I just communicated it really poorly, or like this is something that you've got to work within your heart, right? Because maybe the money is gripping your heart. And maybe you're more focused on the temporal things than you are the eternal things. Now, luckily for you guys, we really only preach about giving one time a year. We'll talk about it and have little reminders about it. But I'll tell you this. We don't do that because the topic's not important. Because as I talked about before, I would dare say there are few topics that are more important to our walk with Christ just because of the detriment that finances can be and how it can grip our hearts and become an idol. So where are you with it? What is the Lord doing within your heart, right? As you look at these scriptures and you read them clearly for what they say, as you leave here today, what is the Lord settling on your heart specifically? What do you need to do? Because nobody else can know that other than you, right? Where you're sitting today. This isn't a call for everybody to come up and to move to the offering boxes and to give at one point, right? It's for you to look at the condition of your heart and to refocus your heart on God. And within that refocusing, if God moves you to give, great. If he doesn't, and your heart's positioned well with God, great. But we're focused on the heart behind giving. Everything that we're talking about ultimately when we give back to the Lord, we're talking about this refocusing, is all about the condition of our heart. And is our heart pointed towards God, or is it kind of tilted towards something else in the world? And looking at that within our lives and seeing, are there decisions I need to make, right? Are there steps I need to take? Are there relationships I need to build or break off? And only you specifically know what that is in your life. And it's going to take intentional time with the Lord, right? Because these things that grip our hearts, like they don't typically grip them overnight. Like slowly over time, they'll take it piece by piece, right? And before you know it, they got like a huge portion of it. And to think that your heart will probably be turned over to that right in that time, and you won't be tempted by those things, or you won't have to continue to kind of reorient your life, is foolish, right? But it's taking little steps of faith just to see where God would have you specifically, and then moving, right? Taking action to those steps of faith. That's why we make the things that we do here so simple, right? That's why we just have a volunteer orientation if you want to take a step of faith and start using your gifts. And even group orientation tonight if you just want to start using your gifts. And that's why we don't have offering plates being passed, right? So there's no compulsion there. Like for you, you can freely give in the back as God would lead you to give. You can do it online as he would lead you to give, right? And you can even meet the needs of the saints as he would lead you to freely give. But ultimately, as it comes back to, and I keep saying, that is between you and the Lord and where your heart is specifically with that. Let's pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your word. God, there are, there's so many passages